Winter Latina Show.
Hosted by IDM.
And we are live mostly everywhere. Yes.
Welcome to another fun-filled episode of the Winter Latina Show, number 14. It's kind of hard to believe that we're here. We are celebrating Victory Day, May 9th today. So we have a whole slew of related topics to cover. But first, Marcelo would like to make an announcement.
Yeah, so this is mostly for the Brazilian people. So due to the recent situation in Rio Grande do Sul, which is the south end state of Brazil, we had a lot of rains and there's been a lot of tragedy, natural tragedy in the, well, I don't like to call it natural tragedy. That's just, politicians that didn't do their job, because this kind of situation happened every year since I'm alive. So nothing new there. But just to remember for the Brazilian people that we have all the links and PIX. PIX is a way for those who are not in Brazil. It's a way of payment. You have a lot of links and PIX keys if you want to donate and help the people in the South. Okay, so let's go with the Victory Day.
Yes, it sounds like. Well, I just wanted to comment. It sounds like it's a flood, correct? It's a flood situation. Yeah, so that sounds like. Well, I'm just thinking of Japan, where certain things happen and governments are good and responsible in that regard, maybe not in terms of foreign policy, but nonetheless, if you look at some of the natural disasters, it's something that is also recurrent. So I think there are limits as to how much people can do, but of course, governments can always do better. So what I would like to do on this 79th anniversary of, well, what people in Russia call Victory Day, we can call it the end of the Second World War in Europe. Of course, the Asia-Pacific theater went on for a few more months until officially September 2nd. So I would like to start by reading a quotation, and it's not sort of the most indicative quotation of Western historians talking about the Soviet participation in the Second World War, but I think it's also very telling. And it's specifically about the Battle of Berlin, so very, very, very late World War II, and the consequences. And it's coming from two American historians, Ambrose and Brinkley, from a book that has had multiple editions called The Rise to Globalism. I actually would recommend this book. It's quite good, although as you're heading into more of the present day, where they talk about, let's say, the way to the Iraq War, I would say objectivity is beginning to falter. But the period from the early 20th century up until, let's say, the end of the Cold War is pretty decent. It's not perfect, but it's decent. So here is the quotation, quote, "While Eisenhower's forces occupied southern Germany, the Russians battered their way into Berlin, suffering heavy casualties, probably in excess of 100,000. Herbert Feiss, or Face, I'm not sure how to pronounce this name, points out that they gained, quote, the first somber sense of triumph, the first awesome sight of the ruins, the first parades under the pall of smoke," end quote. 2 months later, they gave up to the West over half the city they had captured at such an enormous price. At the cost of not a single life, Great Britain and the United States had their sectors in Berlin, where they remained through the Cold War, end quote. So Marcelo, as you can see, it's not a summary of the whole war, but it's a very, very specific incident. And it shows the sheer scale of capturing, the capital of the enemy's country at this time. And then it shows that the Soviet Union just gave it up to the Allies. and they didn't really have to do much about it. And in fact, when we look at revisionism, this is sort of a side topic that is more related to the Cold War, but usually it's the Soviet Union that is blamed for the division of Berlin into East and West, but actually it was the United States government that initiated that division through various means from the mid to the late 1940s by, let's say, supporting a currency in West Germany and basically breaking the agreements for the quadripartite division between the Allies in the immediate aftermath of World War II. So what do you think about this idea where you essentially use 100,000 men, according to the statistic? I'm not sure if it's accurate, but it still shows the scale. And then you just give it up to the Allies, sort of the big three, right? The United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. What does that make you think of first?
Well, first of all, what I think is, so if you have some type of alliance and some type of agreement between allies, I mean, if you fulfill the objectives and then, you have this alliance, everybody has to divide the cake, as we say in Brazil, okay? We have to share the cake. We won, we need to get money. We need to get paid, reparations and everything from what we did. And well, one thing that puzzles me a little bit is that, well, there's this side that if it wasn't by Hiroshima and Nagasaki, for example, the Soviet Union would have kicked the French on the Atlantic, would drive all the way to the Atlantic borders. And so my question in this point is, what puzzles me at this point is that, was it before it that it was decided to stop there, or they stopped because there was a clash of armies on that position? Clash of armies, let's say, because there was no war between the allies.
Sure. Well, obviously, again, they're officially allies, although tensions between them existed from the very beginning, ideological tensions, right? So you sort of had the liberal, nominally democratic camp, although Great Britain was a massive colonial power still, but we're sort of, the West likes to classify them as this liberal democracy. And the United States, even though the United States had lots of contradictions to what a liberal democracy is. But nonetheless, this is usually how it's perceived, right? So you have the Anglo-Americans in the big three, and then you have the Soviet Union, which was more of a state-controlled economy. It was, some describe it as a highly authoritarian state, especially in the Stalin period, etc. So you had that ideological clash, but despite the clash, this was a very successful alliance if you actually look at what they had achieved in this war. And so officially, right, they should not have been fighting. I think the example of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is quite good because lots of historians have made very credible claims that it was not necessary to use atomic bombs on, for the first time in a war context. They were just invented. In Japan, because Japan was basically, it was done, right? But it was not officially surrendering because of certain cultural issues. And so the United States and the Soviet Union already had an agreement for Soviet entry into the Japanese war theater. And in fact, that agreement was finalized in Potsdam, right, in the summer, in July of 1945. And then the United States still went ahead and, struck the civilians of those two cities. And mostly, of course, it was the civilians that suffered. It wasn't, military targets. And it was kind of a similar situation previously, let's say, with the firebombing of Tokyo. It wasn't just, military targets that were destroyed. It was, massive civilian death toll. And so the argument here is that this was more about showing off this new, awesome, destructive weapon to the Soviet Union in the context of what turned to be a Cold War, instead of actually either punishing Japan for Pearl Harbor or bringing a decisive victory. Because the Soviet Union, per agreement, even though by then Hiroshima had already been struck, entered Manchuria the next day. And this is like a massive army, right? Over 1 million people. And this is an army that has had tremendous experience in Europe. and the European theater of war was by then done, right? The army was free to fully focus on the Asia-Pacific theater. So regardless of bombing or not bombing, that war would have been over very, very shortly. And it was, again, the Soviet bodies that were being used to bring that war to completion. So again, the argument that the nuclear strikes were completely unnecessary is quite credible. You know, it's kind of an outside topic that we can discuss a little bit later. I think it's a fascinating subject, but you kind of have these little indications, right, towards the end of World War II that this ideological rivalry is by no means over. In fact, is going to increase despite this quite successful cooperation between, you know, the three powers: the Anglo-Americans, Britain, the U.S., and the Soviet Union. And so so officially, there shouldn't have been any sort of massive disagreements in terms of pushing through. And if you look at Stalin's behavior at various wartime conferences, right, when they went to Iran, when they obviously had one in Yalta, they had one in Germany, right, in Potsdam, Stalin actually stood by his word. I mean, he had very particular things that he was seeking. He wanted to have more of the control over what today is called Eastern Europe. So for instance, Poland, and that was about pushing the border as far away from the Soviet Union as possible, right? And, you know, again, Poland likes to talk about being occupied by the communists. Poland got a huge chunk of land from Germany, right? They would like to say they got it back. Germany would like to say they took it from them, right? There was this massive movement of people. Some people refer to it as ethnic cleansing of Germans. So there are all of those things going on at this time as well that were not really pretty. But from Stalin's perspective, he had a country that had been devastated. It's a country that had been invaded multiple times through that, basically in that direction, so through the Polish corridor, if you want to put it in this way. And so from his perspective, I don't think there was a manpower to push as far as you can go into Western Europe. B, it was more about the safety of the Soviet people for the country that has been absolutely destroyed. And, you know, it's probably a good time to name some statistics, right? Officially, 27 million people perished. Most of them were civilians. I think obviously very difficult to make estimates about war on the scale. All the unknown soldiers that disappeared, you know, technically they're missing. Obviously they're dead, but it's very difficult to arrive at these statistics. And officially it's 27 million. I've seen the numbers for soldiers ranging from 9 to 12 million. So again, a huge number, but not the dominant percentage of this number. The only country that suffered more, again, officially, is China, right? No one else has suffered that tremendous loss of life. And in our very first episode, we talked with our expert from St. Petersburg, and he talked about the fact that, you know, statistics really started to be looked at in detail probably around the 1980s. And this is the official number that was arrived upon, but some people say that it might be actually higher, you know. So I've seen estimates in the 43 million. So I think this is one of those open questions, but it's still, 27 million is a number that is very difficult to imagine, right? It's larger than the population of many, many small countries, right? So it's something that has impacted every single family in, the former Soviet Union, which is why people in those places still think about Victory Day as kind of that, as a symbol, even though, it's now been such a long time, like decades and decades and decades. This is why I think this is one of the questions people ask: why do you even bother marking Victory Day? What is the point? So when you look at the numbers and you compare it to, let's say, the losses in the United States, for instance, or Canada, it's very, very, very different. So it's something that has impacted the entire country. So if I were to look at my family, I can say that one of my family members actually volunteered on the first day, but he was repeatedly rejected because of his poor eyesight. And so he ended up, luckily, surviving, right? He ended up staying I wouldn't exist otherwise. Again, that puts things into perspective. He, being an architect and an engineer, he was in Georgia, so he worked on sort of military reinforcements. He worked on reinforcing it's known as the Georgian military road. It's a very important transportation route and hub, et cetera, in the Caucasus. You know, the Nazis were very interested in the Caucasus. And so this is what he did. My another side of the family, sort of the older people lived in Nazi German occupation until they were liberated. They survived. Any questions I asked, their descendants, they say they never wanted to talk about it. So I have no information, but you can probably extrapolate from other historic documents what their life was like as peasants, essentially farmers in a small village in very close to the border of today Ukraine and Belarus. So way in Western Russia, right? So you can probably make some guesses as to what their life was like and why they never really wanted to talk about it afterwards. I had another family member that was a nurse, a woman, and another family member who participated in actually the Allied, what is today called the Murmansk Run, or as Americans say, the Murmansk Run in the far north, right? This is when they would transport various kinds of supplies, right, through the north, very, very dangerous, and they would bring them to Murmansk, and the Soviets would pick them up and use them through Lend-Lease. And so this family member, when you asked him about it, I mean, I was too little to ask him, but this is through other family members, they would say, what do you remember from this? This is amazing. You actually directly worked with the Allies. He's like, I remember drinking with the Americans. So that kind of shows you, it's I think the regular soldiers and sailors, he was in the Navy, probably worked together quite well, despite any ideological disagreements that their leadership and their country's directions may have had, right? So this is just one example, right? So obviously you have other families where they may have shown, extreme examples of heroism, right? So this is why we look at it. It's, I like to look at it as a form of maybe almost like ancestor worship. If you look at the Immortal Regiment, right? So I should probably, do you know what the Immortal Regiment is? No idea. So this year has been sort of canceled in person, very sadly, possibly for security reasons, possibly because they also like to have it, the ex-Soviet communities, ex-Russian and other republics, like to have it in Europe. So probably there's some political issues, right, to say the least, around these events. I think some of them were able to do it, but overall they're not doing it this year. And basically, it's something that started up in the 2000s, and it really grew. It's sort of this grassroots thing, but of course, eventually it received publicity and government support. But it started as from what I can understand, I wrote an article about it a few years ago. And basically everyone finds a photograph of one of their family members that participated in what we call the Great Patriotic War, or World War II, right? The Great Patriotic War started in 1941 with the invasion through Operation Barbarossa in June 22nd. And so everyone just puts it on, prints it out and walks around with it. It's almost like I don't want to make a religious comparison, but there is that ancestor veneration type quality to it, where everyone finds something personal about it. And when you see large cities with millions of people marching with their family members and having that connection, it's really a powerful sight. And then you might see some really small villages somewhere in the north, and it's May 9th, they still have snow, the weather is pretty crappy, and they're still doing it. It might be like 20 of them, right? It really does provide a certain sense of unity, right, for the country, even, the former Soviet republics, but also that personal connection. So I like to look at it as, again, it might sound kind of weird as, a form of ancestor veneration, but really this is kind of a modern version of it, right? So you are obviously honoring someone and something that happened quite recently, right? Not hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago, but there is that component. And of course, if you look at different cultures, especially let's say in Asia, there is that idea of ancestor veneration, how China has the Qingming festival where you're supposed to go and sweep the graves and you sort of remember people who came before you, and other cultures have something, many other cultures have something similar. Europe, I think, once had something like this as well. It's probably been more lost. So it's kind of interesting to me that in the Russian context, this very primordial idea has been reborn through World War II remembrance, right? And so I would also say that it's, it may sound very propagandistic and cheesy, but again, me thinking about that, had my family member actually volunteered and been taken and been shot, because most of the people who went and were accepted, they're all dead, I would not exist. So to me, that really does put things into perspective. And I think a lot of people do think of it in this way. If my grandpa or great-grandpa or whomever didn't do this thing or died, I would not be here, right? So it goes beyond, we destroyed this toxic ideology. It goes to the very existence of a people, right? So if you think about, again, Hitler's plans with a Lebensraum, right, for sort of the Soviet Union, the Ukrainian territory, and the European part of Russia, his idea was to use that for Greater Germany, right? So it was very clearly, indicated in as far as his plans go.
So one thing that while you were saying about worshiping ancestry and stuff like that, one thing that I find extremely interesting living here in Italy and as a Brazilian, because Brazil's participation in World War II was important for the size of it. Brazil sent like 30,000 troops, no more than that, but it was successful in its jobs, what it had to do, and with an extremely low loss rate. So I think about less than 500 men perished in the Brazilian army, mostly fighting here in Italy, actually, and mostly I believe all of them fight here in Italy. And it's very celebrated. The Brazilian army is very celebrated here in Italy. You have several monuments all over Italy, celebrating. And I have to say that because just yesterday, someone asked in the comments, why you don't talk about the Brazilian participation. Well, it wasn't huge,
right? But
it was important for the size of it. Let's say.
Was it? From what I understand, it was because of the United States. The PR in Central and South America, they were able to get other countries in the Americas on the Allied side, right? This is from what I understand. And in countries, was this the case with Brazil? I know with countries that did not necessarily send a lot of troops, they just use resources, right? They use certain types of metals for industrial production. Was this the case in Brazil as well?
Well, Brazil actually joined the war when some of its commercial ships were torpedoed by German. Or that's the official entry.
Right.
I'm not sure it was exactly like that right now, but that was the excuse to join the war. So Brazil created several American bases in the territory, to help logistics and everything, and send 30,000 troops, which is neglectable, let's say, but in the big picture. But for the specific task, they were very successful. So what my point was that I fully understand that a Brazilian person, for example, can leave and learn history. Like the D-Day was the Victory Day was when the American troops. I can understand that, but going around here in Italy, each and every city. I mean, I don't know, 1 kilometer away from my house, there is a cross, a small monument, so these people from these neighborhoods You know, it's like 10 people, 12 people from this neighbor, from this area, from this small area. You have a cross here. In each city, in the main Duomo or church, you're gonna have a list of sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands of names that perish on
and of course Italy had a obviously very complicated history, right? It was an Axis power, but there was resistance, right? And you could go to the level of just simple, you know, farmers or townspeople in small towns kind of helping. Like when the Americans actually came to Italy, they would be covertly helping. Again, I'm not as much of an expert on that, but I have read some very interesting kind of, let's say, anecdotes about these events. And then, of course, right, Italy, once it got rid of Mussolini, right, there was a change. So.
That's, you know, the word partisan actually comes from partigiani, who were the resistance against Mussolini, and then of course Germany invaded its ally,
invaded its ally.
Italy. Why not? That's why alliances are made for, right? And then we have the participation of Brazil mostly here in Chile. But my point was that what I find very interesting, I've been to Austria last year in Vienna. You have a beautiful piazza, a beautiful place dedicated to the Red Army. It's a fantastic monument.
Right, yeah. Yeah, and I think that's the question, because I know this is one of those questions. Why does Germany mark this in any shape or form? Germany was sort of the source of the evil, right? This evil ideology. But again, right, Germany, well, first of all, Germany today obviously negates it, even though it's been helping Ukraine, which is a bit sketchy, but we'll ignore that. But obviously Germany also, yes, Germany had lots of people that were on board with, with Hitler, but Germany also had people who were not on board with Hitler, right? It did have a resistance movement too. So perhaps it shouldn't be marked as a victory day in Germany, but it should be some kind of reflection and remembrance, right? Because this is such a larger than life war, right? That impacted so many countries, especially countries in Europe. Obviously, countries in Asia, although some people would make the claim that the two theaters in Europe, I guess the North African one was a little bit closer related to Europe, and then the Asia Pacific was a little bit different. But, you can kind of make an argument in both ways, that there's sort of two different situations that had a connection, or other historians would make the claim that no, they're very closely related. This is why we call them World War II. So be that as it may, again, it's kind of an outside topic for people to investigate at a later date. So yes, it's definitely so when you're walking around in Italy, you're walking on land where these battles took place, where certain events took place, where certain people died. So the sort of the earth, the soil, right, the landmarks, maybe the ones that have been rebuilt, remember. So it's same in Russia. You can go into any given forest in the European part of Russia. You're probably going to come across some landmine somewhere or some remnant of something. You might come across a skull of a soldier that has been, who is considered to be an unknown soldier, right? This is what we call them, who's been permanently lost. He's considered to be forever missing, obviously, by now dead. I mean, it was probably obvious within the first couple of years that this person is never coming back, but officially they would be classified as missing. So you kind of have a whole country, right? Or at least the European part of the country that the land remembers, right? Not just the people and their ancestors, their great uncles, grandpas, great grandpas, etc., but the land itself, right? You literally have, some places are better than others in terms of putting up signs that such and such event took place here or such and such person died here. But when you actually start paying attention, it's kind of remarkable, the scope and scale. And so again, this is why, even though we're many, many decades removed from this, it's something that is definitely very impactful. And, it's a good message to teach your little children, to teach your little grandchildren who may not have met, grandpa or great grandpa who has now passed away, because obviously this is another thing, right? So initially, in Russia or in the Soviet Union back then, the Victory Day was celebrated. It was marked. It was not marked by a parade in the Red Square every year, right? It took a few years to make it a national holiday where it was sort of a day off work. It was definitely marked, but it was not marked to the scale that it was marked sort of towards maybe the latter part of Soviet history. And of course, by then it was also very much about remembering the very specific participants in these events. And now we're at a point where most of them have passed, right? The ones who have survived, because, you know, the ones who were teenagers are now very, very old. And so this is another thing. You're seeing these living legends. They're not necessarily someone who performed some absolutely amazing feat that is incomprehensible, right? It might have been sort of more of a run-of-the-mill nurse. Again, it's thrown into very, very intense circumstances, but it's still like it's a living witness. This is the kinds of people, historians who work with oral history, this is the kinds of people they interview and record interviews with. So there is some kind of direct comment from these participants that you can later write, you know, sort of historic works on, right, by using other types of information. So this would be another reason to mark this day, even though it's, you know, it's now removed by several decades. And like I said, we call it Great Patriotic War. And the interesting thing is that up until then, it was the Napoleonic War in Russia that was called the Great Patriotic War. So they actually rebranded it because this was, well, first of all, there's that parallel, right, about being invaded through the Polish corridor by, you know, a Western power. But also, obviously, at that point, this was the Great War of, you know, the fatherland or the motherland, however, whatever term you prefer to use. And so, you know, perhaps, or hopefully there's not another war of that scale. And so perhaps maybe 100 years from now, assuming NATO is not going to blow us up in some nuclear disaster, you know, crossing fingers, please, Stoltenberg, go run a bank instead of doing what you've been doing, being, in my opinion, a PR agent for the, you know, the Western military-industrial complex, again, my opinion. But yeah, I think perhaps 100 years from now, people would have, you know, they would be far removed from this event, and they may have, you know, they may not necessarily reframe it, but they may have sort of other opinions about it. It might be more of a memory as opposed to this very visceral thing for people today. And that's quite possible. It happens, right? It happened with the Napoleonic Wars, right? This is kind of what history does. But, you know, right now we are where we are, and certainly it's also something that is being used for propaganda purposes, right? For historical revisionism, to the extent that really is kind of hard to imagine, because we used to make jokes and memes about it, and then, you know, a few years from when we initially created these memes, all of a sudden it's reality. It's just like, oh crap, we manifested this BS. So yeah, it's actually kind of remarkable what's been going on in terms of Western historical revisionism. But I would say it started earlier. Marcelo, have you ever seen a graph? I'll just post it on my community tab. It's kind of a famous graph, and it's from France, and it tracks perception. Yeah, it's a famous, right? It's a famous little graph. Tracks the perception of who made the greatest contribution to, as far as the Allies go, to victory over Nazi Germany. And the dates are like immediately 1945, 1994, and 2004. So by now we're 20 years removed. So the numbers are probably even worse. And so the initial numbers are in favor of the Soviet Union. So I'm looking at it right now, 57% versus for the USSR, 20% for the US, and 12% for Britain. So this is in France. But when we get to 2004, the perception is very different. The only 20% of the people voted for the USSR, and what is it, 50? It's like blurry here. 58% voted for the United States, and then Britain got 16. So the roles of the US and the USSR have reversed. What is your opinion about the change from the immediate event, people observing it as it was happening, 1945 versus 2004? What happened?
Well, exactly. That's what the point that I was making when I was mentioning Brazil. I mean, it's as a Brazilian, it's very interesting. That's how I learn in school. You
Mhm.
know, I'm 42. I'm almost 43 next week, and
Happy early birthday.
thank you. There's still one show before before that, but it's okay. In any case, that's how my history books were, portraying the victory, D-Day, the forces of, I could understand since I'm Brazilian, and they could do it to also, make the participation of Brazil more relevant for the facts. Okay, so yeah, the war was won by the West, not by the East. I could understand that. And since, as I said, it's one ocean away from Brazil, the perception of people, we didn't have these people that lived through that period, well, 30,000, but they were, their perception was probably the same. We are winning this here, or they were thought they were winning that year there. But the point that I made was exactly about Europe, because it's impossible to have this perception when you are basically stumble over, small graves or monuments or
Monuments,
huge
yeah,
monuments.
right.
So okay, so this is a very well done psyops from the last 79 years. You are here. Well, probably they use the communist, the evil communist as the base for that. And even like that is very hard here in Italy, for example. The communist sentiment, let's say, the communist ideology is very strong. The Italians. I have a friend, for example, that is described himself as communist, and we still go around, and you have communist, what's it called? Paper given in the streets, pamphlets,
Like pamphlets, yeah, interesting.
pamphlets, and that was shocking for me when I saw
Actually,
that.
yeah, it is interesting for me to hear, because it sounds like Italy has more of a, at least street level, more diversity of political opinions, because I don't think you really would see that. I mean, maybe in like Toronto, Canada, you might see it in kind of a more liberal city, but generally it's kind of hard to imagine that this would happen in other West, and I might be wrong.
Older people. Older people, the young people, well, the young people, the TikTok generation is completely away from whatever realities. They simply don't get that, and that's when you look at.
Well, I would make an argument that they've been quite active with the whole Palestinian question. So perhaps there is some interest coming from some percentage of them that are not more into consumerism, but they're actually into. They have some interest in engaging in political affairs.
That's because the horror hit TikTok.
Yes, that's true.
You cannot hit the horror of World War II on TikTok.
Of course, right. No, you're right about that for sure. So yeah, it's so. Do you see this as sort of a combination of Cold War propaganda and then Hollywood movies? I mean, it's kind of hard to think of outside of that. So like the Saving Private Ryans of the world, those types of sort of really larger than life. Sure. Yeah, it seems like, because especially this is a survey in France, right? France was sort of in the middle of the occupation, and so it's, well, I mean, you could kind of make that argument about other European countries, even if they weren't directly occupied by Germany, they're certainly suffered in in other ways. So yeah, it's kind of a remarkable number to me, and it definitely goes to this idea that is still being debated, and I find it to a certain extent kind of insulting. How much? Well, the argument is not how much did Lend-Lease coming from the United States help the Soviet Union, because no doubt it helped. The argument is that without Lend-Lease, everyone would be drinking Bavarian beer these days, and that is just an absolutely outrageous argument. Because if you look at those statistics, Well, first of all, the United States was making money. This was not a volunteer effort, and it was making gold, right? It was being paid in gold. And it took us, the Soviet Union, by the end of the war, actually it took a few years to pay off all the debt. So it was, it was respecting the fact that it had debts in this regard. So, the United States was making pretty penny off of Lend-Lease. Now, if you actually look at very specific statistics, the numbers are not that high. So you could say for various types of, they sent some military vehicles, they sent, certain types of food supplies, like it was everything. But it's definitely important, but it's by no means decisive. And if you actually look at some very particular articles on the breakdowns, you will see that it's simply true. It's something that helped, but it was not the decisive factor. And so, but the thing that gets me about this, it's kind of the same thing that you see today with Ukraine, where the expectation is that we pump money into you and you use your bodies, your blood, your life to do something, is really kind of, as even though, in today's context, Ukraine is on the opposing side of the barricades being used, in my opinion, by NATO countries against Russia. It's the same idea of where we're not going to mar our hands too much. Someone else is going to die. And then money is going to be equivalent, and cars and maybe oil is going to be equivalent to human life. And to me, that is really kind of immoral and outrageous. The fact that this comparison would even be made. Again, it's not something that is completely insignificant. It was something that was important, especially in the beginning of the war. We must remember that Stalin attempted to industrialize the Soviet Union in basically 10 years. 1928 was the first 5-year plan. And it was usually countries took several decades when they industrialized naturally, right? Whatever that meant, without sort of extreme state intervention. Here you had this breakneck pace industrialization that by 1941, by the time Hitler invaded the southern part of the Soviet Union, the USSR was like in an okay shape. And of course, you can talk about other issues with Stalin's treatment of certain military officials that was problematic, and that would be sort of, we could talk about that in a maybe more specific World War II, maybe technical kind of episode, right? We can maybe have another expert on, but so we're sort of beyond that scope. But generally, again, remember, USSR was like 70% agrarian. And then all of a sudden, it comes out this industrial superpower. So if it weren't for that 28 to 41 period, this to me is like, regardless of what you think of Stalin, if this did not happen, USSR would not have been able to stand up to Nazi Germany in any shape or form. I mean, to me, it's a very, very clear answer. And so, yeah, going back to this comparison of money and things, a very kind of mercantile attitude. I don't know how else, to me, in Russian, when we say mercantile, it's kind of an offensive term, or at least it has a negative connotation. So kind of having this mercantile attitude and then comparing it to human life. We're seeing it today in Ukraine. So it's not something that has gone away, where you have that comparison, right? So I don't know. I feel really gross about that. But be that as it may, if you look at actual statistics, it doesn't have to be Soviet historians or Russian historians if you don't want to believe them for whatever ideological reason. You can go look at Western historians, and the percentage that you see is somewhere between 75 to 80% of Nazi German losses, thanks to the Red Army. I mean, it is an undeniable percentage. You will see it across the board. Like I said, there's a little bit of that variation. Is it 3/4? Is it more like 80%? But it's overwhelmingly, right, credited to the actions of the Red Army.
You don't even have to go to very respectful historians from the West or from the East, whatever. If you go to Wikipedia, our most reliable fount of source of data,
Right.
Which is extremely
anti-Soviet, anti-Russian, yeah,
anti-Russia and manipulated by Western powers, you're gonna see some numbers that are very easy to understand. I mean, the East Front of Germany had 5 million men, while the West Front of Germany had 500,000 people. So, you know, the East Front was against Soviet Union, 5 million men. 27 million Soviets perish.
Right.
As official numbers.
Let's say 9 to 12 million military
soldiers,
yeah.
yes, but you know, the civilians were getting involved on that.
But when you sort of the other argument is like, look, you lost so many people fighting a small German army. It wasn't a small German army; it was a massive German army. So when you look at those
chunk of
and the best, so when you look at those casualties, it's actually it actually checks out. You know, the estimates for the Soviet losses versus the estimates for the Nazi German losses. And so, to me, it's like, again, there's on the one hand, you have this money and things comparison versus human investment. And on the other hand, you have very, very, very obvious numbers, like you're saying, very easily understood numbers that are they predominantly credit the Soviet Union. They don't say that the Western Allied participation is completely irrelevant in Europe, but you have that really skewed percentage, which, you know, again, I don't know how you can even argue with these numbers, but people still do, right? And so the other thing I think that always comes up, especially in the modern context, is the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which is like, to me, again, it's such an easy answer, right? So for whoever doesn't know what that was, right? In 1939, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany signed a non-aggression pact. And you have all these little talking heads and sometimes even freaking pundits, which blows my mind. And to me, it's like, you're either a moron or you're deliberately misleading people, because in a military alliance and a non-aggression pact, clearly defined, are two very different things. But that's one thing. The Soviet Union was literally the last power to sign a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany. Yet this is the only one that gets brought up. You can go to our favorite source, the Wikipedia, right, that you just mentioned. I have it right in front of me. And you can go, and I don't even think this is a complete list, but you have the German-Polish Declaration of Non-Aggression from 1934. You have a whole bunch of other ones, right? You can keep going to 1939. You have the German-Danish Non-Aggression Pact, 1939, et cetera, et cetera. So you have a whole slew, German-French from 1938. You have a whole slew of, some of them have a little bit of different verbiage, but generally they're supposed to be non-aggression pacts. Why isn't it that no one else is calling these other things alliances, but for some reason, they're talking about the Nazi-Soviet alliance, which it wasn't. I mean, again, it's either you are a moron with an IQ of room temperature measured in Celsius or below in Celsius, not in Fahrenheit for our North American friends that use Fahrenheit. No, Canadians use Celsius. Thank you, Canadians.
Kelvin, even better.
Kelvin, right? Absolute zero. But and so it's like, again, it's very easily accessible information. It's very clear. So when you are changing the meaning of very clearly defined terms, you're doing it for one of two reasons. There is no, the third is not given. It's either you're just not very smart, or you're misleading people for some ideological purpose. And so when they say, well, okay, fine, the Soviet Union went into Poland and Nazi Germany went into Poland. And for some reason they forget the Munich Agreement, when Poland went into Czechoslovakia and Germany went into Czechoslovakia. So if you're going to be talking about who went where and you're going to be critical of the Soviet Union, it's kind of hard to ignore that Poland, that was, invaded by Germany a year later, did the same thing a year prior with Czechoslovakia, right? So again, when you're leaving out very crucial pieces of information that are very basic, easily accessible history, it's like you're not lying, but you're selectively presenting this information I'm not sure to whom, because again, anyone can access it, even on highly biased sources like Wikipedia. You're clearly doing it to achieve a particular goal, right? But that's not even the worst of it. I'm not sure if you've seen some of the tweets, especially this year, coming from Polish officials, coming from Baltic officials, where they talked about what was part of the Soviet operation going towards Berlin. Again, very clearly, they completely leave out the context. And I have the Estonian tweet in front of me today. 80 years ago, Tallinn was devastated by the March bombings, blah, blah, blah. They're claiming that they say Russian, it was the Soviet Union, but as you can see, when it suits them, they say Russia. When it doesn't suit them, they say, oh, victory was also Ukrainian and Russian and, Kazakh or whatever. So it's, again, like little language games here. They're claiming that the Soviet Union, for reasons that are unclear, mostly targeted cultural landmarks. And it's like, why? And the key point here is, quote, Russian playbook is the same today. So obviously they're completely leaving out the context. They make it sound, again, if I were an alien looking at this tweet, I would think that 80 years ago, for no reason whatsoever, Russia invaded Little Estonia, bombed cultural landmarks and residential buildings, and today it's doing the same thing. There's just zero context to this. And again, Polish officialdom did something very similar where the context was completely left out. Now, you could say it's very unfortunate that civilians suffered as part of this operation. You would probably be right. And, this is something that happened all the way through. It happened through the Western Allied bombings of German cities, of Dresden, right, where huge numbers of civilians died. It wasn't just soldiers. You can talk about the American bombings of Tokyo, the firebombing. Again, I mentioned this in the very beginning of the episode, where huge numbers of civilians died. And that's completely legitimate. But when you're framing it in this way, and you're literally leaving out the reason why the Russians, right, i.e. the Soviet Union, was there, it's just absolutely preposterous. So again, the level of revisionism is kind of remarkable to me. And of course, you've also seen similar things, on January 27th, they mark the liberation of Auschwitz. And they sort of link it to, obviously, Holocaust Remembrance is, I believe, this month, right? But they basically link it to there's a couple of months of where different concentration camps were liberated. I think Dachau was liberated April, May, right? So this is why they mark it today. It was liberated by Americans. So Russians would not say that Dachau was liberated by Russians, because it wasn't. But whenever you see this, the tweets, again, from former presidential candidates like Hillary Clinton and a whole bunch of other people, they just completely leave out who liberated the concentration camp. It's just completely missing. And again, it's misinformation, disinformation by omission. You're not really lying because this thing happened on such and such day, but you're deliberately leaving out the key point. And so then the question is, why are you doing it? They don't want, as part of the current anti-Russian propaganda campaign, which has been insane in terms of, cultural, we're not going to play Tchaikovsky, you're not allowed to read Dostoevsky. I think it's sort of died down a little bit. We've certainly seen really extreme incidents of it like this. But they basically don't want anyone to have any positive perception of Russia. This is why Russia is banned from athletic events, or many, not all athletic events, because, oh, God forbid, someone is going to aspire to be this amazing Russian, figure skater or whatever, right? Same thing here. God forbid they have a good perception of Russia at any point in history. Maybe you can have a bad perception of Russia now, but you can have a good perception of Russia as part of the Soviet Union, right, as part of World War II. So this is their goal. But it ends up just being absolutely comical. Again, I don't know whom this works on. Either people who are just literally were born yesterday, an alien from outer space who's never been, to this planet. I really hope aliens don't come here. They'll be pretty horrified by what's going on. Or someone who is deliberately being, misleading you. There's no other explanation.
But didn't you hear the United States have alien weapons now?
Yes, very important. Which is kind of interesting why this kind of information has been coming out lately. But again, that's a different tinfoil. I should probably there's actually a YouTuber, she does true crime. I don't often listen to her, but she does a good job. She actually she have made a little tinfoil. And whenever she wants to do her kind of crazy conspiracy theory analyses about different cases, she whips out this little hat and puts it on. I might have to rip her off and do the same thing. I'll just have it sitting here. I'll put it on.
We actually did this once here in the channel, but that's extremely hot on the head.
I know.
It's impossible to keep
because
wearing
we're
that.
sitting in front of lights, right? We're sitting in front of lights to make sure you guys can actually see us. And so, yeah, having a tinfoil, it might actually leave some damage. I'm suffering for this podcast.
I mean, it seems. Look, that my perspective today about the leadership, Western leadership, North American leadership, is that they have a playbook, and they follow that playbook. And if you think like when you had the Cold War and the Iron Curtain and nobody comes here and nobody goes there and all that thing, I remember that movie. I don't know if you watched it. It's an old movie called Gotcha.
The name sounds familiar, but I'm not sure.
It's from late 70s, early 80s. So basically, it was an American boy, a young guy that used to play with paintball guns in the university. And that's why it was called Gotcha, because every time he shot some friend, he said Gotcha. Right. And he went for a school trip in Germany, in West Germany. By the time it was West and East Germany, he went to West Germany, and at some point he met a Western German or a Russian woman who was a spy or something like that, and he kind of fell in love. He was very young and stupid, and he went to East Germany. And the fun part is that he's crossing the wall, the checkpoint, and the person that was checking his documents on this side was the same person that was checking his documents on the other side. So this woman was here and getting his passport. Why are you leaving West Germany? He answered, well, okay, you can go. And then he moves along and is the same person on the other side. Why are you entering East Germany? Blah, blah, blah. So I think this could work. I mean, what they're trying to do, this could work back on that time, and it worked. And we see by that graph, that statistic that you showed about France, it works. But right now, you pick up your phone, you have him in your hand, 24 hours a day, you join some Telegram channels, whatever bullshit it's going there, you're going to see video evidence of everything. You're going to see video. So CNN will not show you, but you're going to see it on Twitter, you're going to see it on Telegram.
And then you can use your own judgment as to what to think about it.
You can use your own judgment. That's one thing that I use, for example, in the channel. When people ask, well, how are you so sure that Russia is winning the conflict? Well, the amount of evidence that you see on Telegram channels and you don't see on CNN, because since all these broadcasts are the media of mass destruction.
It's about like the preponderance of evidence, right? You're looking at different sources. Maybe on its own it doesn't really mean anything. You need context. But when you have lots of pieces that you can put together, you can probably, even like headlines, the way Western headlines have changed, right, over the last 2 years, you can probably arrive at a
you said about the TikTok. About Gaza and TikTok.
Exactly, yeah.
So it's impossible to keep the same, by the book from the Cold War and make it work today. Today you have a broader world, the information.
Well, this is why you have sort of like the maybe not a full collapse of the mainstream media, but definitely a decline, and you have the rise of, we haven't risen yet. Hopefully we will, right? But you have a lot of these independent sources slowly, right? But you know what I'm saying? You have a lot of people, you can listen to them. You might not like what they have to say about one subject. You might like them on a different subject, and you can listen to a bunch of them, right? You can listen to even people in different languages with subtitles, and then you can hopefully arrive at your own conclusion. Now, granted, we do all live within what is, total ideology, right? There's an overall worldview that we're born into and we're raised into, and sometimes it's not completely possible to fully separate from it and be fully objective, but we're definitely doing, I think, a better job with all of these different sources and the preponderance of evidence and media and independent journalists, again, taking it all with a grain of salt, right? You don't know someone's intentions necessarily, but there's just more access, right? So that definitely is, I guess your point is that we don't have that from World War II, right? We certainly have, lots of photographs, we have some videos, we have lots of sources, but it's easier to misrepresent them, not by lying, but by leaving out information. Because I think every single case that I've presented today, it wasn't so much lying, it was just not mentioning the one crucial point or the two crucial points about it. And when you don't mention those things, you can't really be accused of lying, right? You're not just completely, claiming, giving credit to someone else or, claiming that someone else did something. You're basically just not giving the full picture, right? So I guess it's impactful. I don't know, maybe my perception of humans is a little bit optimistic in terms of their desire to find maybe not the truth, but at least fairly accurate information and full information before they can arrive at a pretty decent conclusion. So to me, if I look at some random, even like official Russian government source, I'm not going to see someone maybe not giving sufficient credit to D-Day, right? It's going to be presented as a very, very important turning point. You're going to look at, that moment in summer of 1944 to the point where the Americans and the Soviet troops linked up, right, in April 1945, the famous meeting at the Elbe. And all of that is going to be presented in a decent way. You're not going to be leaving out information. And so to me, also just, again, observing Russian officials on social media, they put so much effort into trying to honor veterans from other countries and doing that kind of sort of lower level, maybe diplomacy, right? Trying to mend bridges where you're honoring people who were from the other allied countries in Canada, US, right? In parts of Europe, et cetera, and you're trying to give them credit, right, for their participation, which probably, again, it almost seems like these Russian officials were giving them more credit than their own countries did, which is really kind of sad. But yeah, so you would see that kind of thing. You would not really see this complete disregard for, oh, well, Canadians only lost this number of people in World War II. It doesn't compare to our losses, right? It's a competition. Therefore, we're not going to honor them. You just don't see them. I mean, the anti-German sentiment in the USSR, like imagine the scale of anti-German sentiment in World War II and immediately after, right? In the decades afterwards, you have multiple cemeteries for Nazi Germans who perished in the European part of Russia and what today would be the former republics. And so German officials sometimes visit these cemeteries. So there is also this decent attitude towards the war dead coming from the enemy, right? Coming from the opposing side in what possibly is the most, the bloodiest war in the history of humanity, in which the Soviet Union lost such a huge number of people, and yet you have this respect towards the war dead. So I would say the way the official, like Russian officialdom is treating this concept, to me seems quite reasonable in all of these different ways. And you just don't see that level of, even though they would be critical of current Western politics, they're not going to be, disregarding the veterans from other countries. They're not going to be closing the cemeteries or something, or tearing down the statues or something like that, the way you would see elsewhere.
Not yet, at least.
Not yet. Well, I don't think Russians are gonna do that, because you never.
No. Sorry. The West.
Yeah. No, the West. Well, you have had that in sort of the more aggressive, kind of smaller countries, the Chihuahuas, that kind of removal of, the closures of cemeteries, moving them elsewhere, statues, monuments, et cetera, et cetera. So you just don't see that. But you also didn't have that same attitude in 2022 at the height of, we're going to prevent you from playing Tchaikovsky, we're going to prevent you from reading Dostoevsky. You had people saying, we really are not fans of the current Western officialdom, but I'm never not going to like such and such British or American author, because I'm going to separate the two questions as they should be. And you constantly had that, talk about propaganda. It's kind of like positive propaganda for these Western powers, saying, their literature and arts are great, but we don't like the current people in power, and we think their trajectory is very destructive. And you just don't really see that at that level of officialdom in the West. In the official West, as we like to call it, the Euro-Atlantic community, the rules-based order, choose your poison here. So yeah, so again, I feel like as far as that goes, Russians just have had, from my limited perception of it, a very reasonable attitude in this regard. So
so we're just over an hour now. There is one question that I have that we kind of talked about during the program, but I would like to try to condense this in one question, which was, so recently there was this BBC guy who went to the Red Square to see the monuments that the trophies that Russia collected in Ukraine, the Western trophies. And the guy kind of freaked out in his explanation of that, and to the point.
Was it like a major BBC reporter?
Yeah, I don't remember his name. He's irrelevant.
Is it Steve Rosenberg, who loves to trash Russia? Like, he's an older, like a seasoned. Yeah, which is kind of funny. Like they're still allowed to run around, and then RT is banned.
No problem.
In Britain, yeah. but no questions there, or France.
Exactly. So he kind of had a meltdown during his reportage, where he where he kind of said, well, families brought their children to see this. This is a kind of bizarre behavior, stuff like that. And I was like,
did he not go to Amsterdam to see a Russian tank displayed in the middle of the city, for example, or Berlin? I think he was to Russian tanks that were captured by the opposing side, presented in various European cities. And I think from what I understand from the media reporting, or even like the grassroots reporting, people would kind of some people would be very happy about, oh, look, it's a broken Russian tank, we conquered it. But other people would bring flowers and leave messages of peace. So it seemed like the local population was actually quite reasonable.
Which was the majority, actually, when they exposed
some of them had
Russian
a huge
tanks.
number of flowers. Yeah, it was very interesting. And so, we don't know who those people are, but it was very, very telling. But to me, it's like, well, you guys are doing the same thing. Like, is that not bizarre?
He actually said that without too many proof, actually. But he actually said, "Well, Kiev did the same. So what's the deal? What's the problem?"
Well, not Kiev just did the same. European capitals did the same. Who are supposedly not direct parties to the conflict. They're only been pumping Ukraine full of weapons since the middle of the 2010s, and training their armies up to NATO standards, et cetera, and more recently pumping billions of dollars that are hard to imagine, but they're not direct, parties to the conflict directly. But you guys did the same thing. I just don't understand. Again, this is like...
Yeah, it's just the double standards. I can understand that, the guy is just a propagandist, but he actually melted down and freaked out. But my question here is that for the Russian people, do they perceive this victory day? So I'll put some context here. I told you that just 2 days ago we had a mega live with 14 channels in Brazil.
I know, I was very impressed. I was like, how did you not crash?
It was 5 minutes each one, and
Brazilians love to do things on a large scale.
yeah, especially barbecue.
Metal concerts,
cool.
South American fans are considered to be the craziest metal fans. Here you have 15 channels streaming together. You just love to do things on a large scale. It's funny.
Yeah,
no,
it was pretty cool.
Yeah,
it was pretty cool, actually.
Cool.
But it was the name of the live stream was like 79 years of victory over Nazi fascism. And well, so I opened the live stream just because I'm more east, so it was later for me. So the commander Farinazo, who is from the Art of War, Arte da Guerra channel, he started from the people that were later time, so we could go to sleep earlier.
Yes, so that the European segment could sleep.
Exactly.
How
Nothing to do
dedicated
with.
You are.
So I opened the thing, and so the first thing was that what I see today is that we didn't win Nazi fascism. Yeah, we beat the German army. Yeah, Mussolini got hanged, but we see today the ideology re-rising again and again and again, and not only as those guys with Rottweiler tattoos on Ukraine. You see the Zionism in Gaza, you see in Israel, you see, well, not only in Israel, all over. You see the exceptionalism in the United States itself. All of this is some type of Nazism, in bigger, smaller scale. At some point, there is no scale. It's just so. My question is that does Russia, as country government and as people, separate? So two different questions. As Russia and Russians see the victory over German Hitlerish army a victory over Nazism, or does it see it as a victory over the army and they wanted to fix the ideology somehow, but they were stopped at a point?
So obviously a very complicated
Going back
question.
to the beginning of the
Yes,
of
and
the
I would
stream.
answer this. So there's the Russian government, there's the Russian people in Russia, and then there's me. So there are sort of three separate ways that I can present this. So first of all, the perception of Victory Day doesn't have to be one thing, right? It's not a mutually exclusive situation. So in the immediate aftermath, right? It's the respect for the war dead, right? For everyone's families that participated, whether in sort of in the background in the factories, people who did not participate in actual combat, or people who actually died or who fought and came back, right? So there's that immediate respect for, the entire country rose up, basically. You also have, like I said, there's a little bit of that feature of ancestor veneration, especially as we move further away from that point, as more and more, unfortunately, veterans pass away that have remained, right, due to old age. There's also that feature. There's sort of this kind of a primordial perception of it, right? So those are the two things. Now, of course, you're celebrating a military victory. If you completely strip everything from that, then yes, countries celebrate a victory and an important war, right? So you can also look at it in this way. But the ideological component is important. It's one of the pieces of the puzzle. So I would present it in this way. So, well, first of all, Russians and other Soviet people experienced the direct ramifications of that ideology on themselves, right? Their families have experienced it, all the atrocities that were perpetrated by the Nazi German troops, and also their collaborators in different parts of the Baltic, Western Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. So you had that. So of course there's the direct impact of what does this thinking lead to, right? So there's that. But what I would also say, so then of course today when you have the revival of Banderites in Ukraine, right, who were basically they like to brand themselves as nationalists, but they definitely worked with Nazi Germany, right? So you could say they were separate, although you also had the ones that had, that were part of the foreign division, right, the Galician division, that were not not directly Banderites in the name, but they had similar ideology of negation, right? We're going to deny the existence of everyone else who is here, the Poles, the Russians, the Jews, etc., and we're going to collaborate with Nazi Germany, right? So you have this revival. But my argument would be, and let me phrase it in this way. Recently, a certain bearded philosopher from Russia gave a big interview to a certain American journalist. And this is something that I think this particular bearded philosopher is one of the best people to present this question in a very simple way. And so the way I like to look at it is very similar. So you have in Europe, let's say the West and Russia, you had these three ideologies of modernity, right? Liberalism was the first ideology to arise. Then you had communism in the latter part of the 19th century. And then you had fascism / Nazism. And so each of those ideologies was in competition with the other. And each of those ideologies had a very particular historical subject. So for liberalism, it is the individual, and the individual completely stripped of any communal ties. For communism, it is class. It's kind of a communal subject, right? And then for fascism, you could say it's the state. And for Nazism, you could say it's ethnicity / race. And then there's this overlap between Nazism and fascism. And so in the aftermath of World War II, Nazism / fascism, it's a difficult question, essentially disappeared, not disappeared completely because we're certainly seeing it the way you've described here and there, but it disappeared as an ideology that could represent or sort of dominate the world, right? And then in 1991, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, we had the disappearance of communism, or the Soviet version of socialism, as an ideology that could also dominate the world. So again, that doesn't mean that communism doesn't exist or that fascism or Nazism doesn't exist. It means that it disappeared as this representation of a modern ideology on a global scale. The only ideology that remained was liberalism. We still have liberalism today. Now, liberalism kind of changed as the only ideology that remained because it continued splintering. So first it was about the individual stripped of any kind of communal rights. Now we have the individual splitting into separate parts. That's why you can have people with different gender identities, et cetera, right? I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. You can go listen to that interview. You can go read similar subjects. And so my answer would be that the point remains that Nazism was conquered in 1945 on a global scale. But that doesn't mean that it's not being used instrumentally by the nominally liberal West. So instrumentally, the moderate rebels were useful in Syria. Instrumentally, the Banderites were useful in 1945 to the 1950s as a kind of insurgency to fight the Soviet Union, backed by certain Western intelligence agencies, as you know. And today, Banderites are useful for the official West to basically to pit them against Russia. So instrumentally, these ideologies are certainly alive and well, and they're being used. But globally, there is only one ideology, and that is liberalism. So in that sense, I would say that yes, the celebration over the conquest of Nazism / fascism, an ideology that had a very different historical subject where you had hierarchies, right, based on sort of ethnic and racial components versus more of a class-based egalitarianism, it was conquered. And this is another kind of a side note. When people compare and say, well, communism and fascism are both awful. And to me, it's just inaccurate because, again, you have these very different perceptions of the world. And one, I think, is very clearly worse than the other when you have that particular hierarchy. And so, yeah, so this is kind of a difficult answer to your question. And I would say it's a multi-part situation, right? So you have immediate impact on the family, you have military victory, but you do also have this ideological component. And I would say that when Putin talks about Ukraine and how it needs to be denazified, it's not the only thing that he talks about. Again, he talks about different things, right? He talks about demilitarization, he talks about neutrality. So whenever you have these Western pundits and the media talking about, oh, this is outrageous, it's so stupid, it's like, well, that's not the only thing that's happening there, but it's one of the components. And it's not a completely irrelevant component, because we've seen, what's been going on in Donbass with these extreme, nationalists that are essentially trying to eradicate this population that is not like them, in their perception. So yeah, it's a difficult question, but I think it has all of these components kind of wrapped into one.
My question kind of is born because when you see what happened in the Chechen wars, for example, and also if you go for another country, you go to China and you see the Uyghurs, the Uyghur community, and then you see how the West portrayed it as ethnic cleansing and all these beautiful words that they love to use. But what I see is that, for example, for Russia, they had 2 wars against the Chechens, but in the end, they managed to bring the population in its majority, of course.
And it wasn't so much against the Chechens. I mean, you had a very significant foreign component coming from different countries that were quite active, not at the lowest level, but at the levels of military control, right? So again, this is why I use Chechnya as a proto-Syria in this regard. But yes, Russia was able to reincorporate Chechnya back to the point where today, at least from what we see in public, I've never been there. They seem to be some of the most patriotic, Russian citizens, and it's very interesting.
At least the army is completely well seen, or well portrayed by the Russian media itself. Ramzan Kadyrov is celebrated. What's the name of that general that was? That was celebrated in the Duma, if I'm not mistaken, and was applauded. Stand up. He received a stand ovation.
His name escapes me right now. I know whom you mean. Yes. Well, it's it might be kind of politically incorrect to say, but some perceive, let's put it this way, people from the Caucasus as being kind of militarily minded. So let's say the Georgians, the Chechens, maybe other parts of North Caucasus. So it's almost like they have had many battles in their past, and they also are more traditional societies in terms of the role of men. And men are perceived as warriors. Again, some people would probably consider this highly politically incorrect. So for them to be able to participate in battle on this scale is probably something that some of them desire. Right. So again, I know that Western liberals are probably would be crying and getting their panties in a bunch over me saying this, and it is kind of a generalized statement. Again, it doesn't pertain to everyone, but that is a perception, sort of that perception of masculinity as being a warrior and a protector, and being able to express yourself in the army and having that experience is probably perceived as a positive for them. So they're probably seeking to participate in, what Russia describes as a special military operation, because they actually some of them get to prove themselves, right, in the battlefield. So it's kind of an interesting thing, because if you were to tell an average Russian in the mid-2000s that Chechens are going to be some of the most patriotic, seemingly Russian citizens, it would be just an impossibility. There's just no way, because obviously when you even though there are these foreign elements, you had urban warfare, and in urban warfare civilians suffer, right? So obviously as part of that of the 2 Chechen wars, you had civilians dying because of the 2 wars, right? So just to imagine that only over a decade later you would have that complete turnaround is really kind of amazing. And this is what makes me feel hopeful about parts of Ukraine, parts of the Ukrainian territory, that there's going to be some kind of an awakening, and there's going to be a reflection and a reconsideration of what actually happened, and how, maybe not for everyone, maybe not for these, I would call them crazed nationalists, but for a sort of ordinary people. And I think there might be, it probably exists today. They're just not loud. They can't be loud. The loudest people are not necessarily representative of everyone. And of course, in that political environment, it's probably not safe for you to really express your true thoughts about the subject. And so this is what makes me hopeful, even though right now, for some people perceive it as a hopeless situation, just seeing what happened with with Chechnya.
Yeah. No, the point that I mentioned Chechnya and the Uyghurs itself, it's because it seems to me that Russia and China, they put a lot of effort in, re-education people, because, as you said, it's civilians suffered, and you need to break the cycle at some point. And it just looks to me that it goes to the beginning of the question. It just looks to me that the cycle was not broken. The cycle of Nazi fascism, it was not broken. The war was won. The Great Patriotic War was won at that point, but the cycle was not broken.
Well, there is that, like, the question then would be, again, it's a very more of a philosophical / ideological question. What is it about liberalism that makes it perceive itself and people who subscribe to this ideology as the best universal ideology that should be exported to other people? There is some kind of a supremacism in that you should be subscribing to our values. Our values are universal. Your values are outdated and barbaric. In it, you do have that level of supremacism. And if you look at the history of some of these supposedly liberal democratic countries, you can see that supremacism in their countries towards perhaps certain segments of their own population. But I don't necessarily think it's enough to fully define an ideology of Nazism or fascism, but you can say there are certain elements, which is why it finds it attractive to use these extremists that normally it would within itself, right? Americans don't like to have people who are extreme within its own ranks, or Canadians or whatever, Germans, right? In Germany, this insignia is banned, but they find it appealing to as an instrument, right? And there's also something about that ideology in terms of supremacy, thinking that we are universal and you're not, and you are inferior to us. This is why you must subscribe to our values. But of course, there are also kind of more practical things, right? If you look at some of the high-ranking Nazi German officialdom, right, that basically went to represent NATO, that was formed in 1949, right? Heusinger is sort of like the most famous example, but there are others as well. So you literally had, people whom the, Americans and Brits fought, now incorporated into the highest ranks of this powerful military alliance, right? Designed to challenge the Soviet Union. So you have that. And then, of course, in the Soviet Union, we talked a little bit about this today, where Khrushchev, after the death of Stalin, for various reasons, he released tens of thousands of Banderites that were imprisoned for various crimes. And there was really no effort, like you're saying, to re-educate, reincorporate. They were just basically left to live, and by some of them or their family members, they certainly maintained their ideology, especially in western parts of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And then they went into the local Communist Party organs. They sort of had their foot into local politics. And of course, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they're able to run free, right, and do whatever they want. And so in that sense, it definitely was not, this ideology was not completely crushed. And so this is why we're seeing this resurgence today in Ukraine, coming from Western Ukraine specifically, but being applying it to the entire country. And it's being rebranded as this, patriotic, nationalistic, instead of, ideology, instead of what it really was, specifically in World War II. So yeah, in that sense, it was not crushed. But again, I would make the argument that it does not exist on a global scale as an ideology that's going to be represented in multiple countries. It is liberalism. And liberalism is the one that's instrumentally using, whether it's, extreme political Islam with, the Syrian situation and some other countries, or whatever is going on in Gaza and Israel. I don't even know what to call the Israeli ideology. I guess officially it's Zionism, right? And then, of course, the Ukrainian scenario with the resurgent 21st century Banderites, and so on and so forth. So yes, instrumentally, it's certainly something that is being used and that still exists.
All right. Do you think we're good?
Yeah, I think we covered well. I mean, it's like such a broad subject that any little tangent that we make, we can go and talk for another 2 hours but I think we sort of covered some of the key points of why this celebration, this plus remembrance, right? It's not just a happy celebration. It's also a kind of a tragic and a maybe happy celebration all wrapped into one, why it is still relevant to people in the former Soviet Union and why it may be less relevant, like you're saying, to people in Brazil, which again makes logical sense. But it's, we're trying to understand each other's cultures by looking at cases like this. And hopefully we developed this understanding a little bit more today. And I know before I tweeted this out, I was like, what is this? Does this mean you're a dirty communist? And I was just like, okay, like this is
why not?
Why not?
Someone called me too liberal.
Too liberal. I know. It's like every day there might be accusations of very conflicting types of opinions being thrown at you all at once in the same format. It's just kind of amusing. But yeah, hopefully we shed some light on this topic. Maybe pissed off a few people, which is always welcome.
Good thing.
Which is always welcome. So yeah, happy Victory Day for those who celebrate. I certainly will. It's too early to raise a glass. And sadly, like Marcelo, I mentioned to you, I'm a fake Slav. I'm not much of a drinker. Yeah, no, I'm just gonna drink my water and drink my coffee that I'll have to remake. That's going to be my celebration for now. But thank you guys for tuning in. I would love to hear your comments specifically on these more complex ideological questions, because I know that's usually where the debate lies. And we will see you in the next episode.
And just as a reminder for my Brazilian friends, links
Please
for
donate.
helping Rio Grande do Sul on the description. All right. See you next week, Nina. See you guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.